Okay, so cyberspace, as we all know, is a bioelectric environment. It combines people, processes, and technology. And for many of us, it's actually a risk management issue, and therefore very much, an economic proposition. It can be complex. There are a number of areas of challenge and difficulty. And many of us would argue that the IXP itself is actually an infrastructure, and not just any infrastructure, but actually one of the critical infrastructures of the modern world and of modern society. But having said that, the cyber threat space is actually quite broad. We have everything from the authentication privilege attacks, attacks on the value chain. Often value chain attacks actually go through IXPs. Also, we have the denial of service, and we've seen certain situations that have been detrimental. And many have argued that the IXP itself potentially is a single point of failure. So even though there might be other peered IXPs, the point is that the particular IXP, if it goes down, can actually cause a lot of inconvenience. And of course, we also have many of the new geopolitical realities. We've seen the rise of basically malicious or bad actors that are state-sponsored. And so there are, this is kind of the milieu of the challenges that we see. So at the end of the day, the IXP endeavors to keep local traffic local, and thereby increasing efficiency, reducing costs. And so it acts as that point of exchange. And so really, we need to get to a situation where, for example, inter-Caribbean data really shouldn't have any business being routed through, third regions, be they the US, Europe, or China, as we've seen arising these days. In Africa, we have suffered because of our colonial past, especially in telecoms, where you want to call the country that you share a border with, the phone call has to be routed, for example, to London, and then across to Paris before coming back to, a country that's 5 kilometers away from you. There's also the national security interest, which I'll touch on a bit later, but it's really, the IXPs are also very strategic from a national security point of view, especially for monitoring. A friend in Singapore, Barry Green, famously said that cyber criminals operate at the speed of light, while law enforcement moves at the speed of law. And it's not just law enforcement, but it's also generally the good guys. So we have to find ways to even up, this equation. So in terms of how it works, I would like to emphasize more on it's about people. I think I've noted several of the earlier interventions have mentioned this. Also, it really boils down to trust in that peering environment. We have found from our experience in Nigeria that really the stakeholder-driven model, while not perfect, is optimum. And then the issues of carrier neutrality are very critical. So we've experimented in Nigeria. We've tried to see where government could impose some kind of, especially the regulator, some kind of exchange mechanism. Quite frankly, it didn't work very well because as many of us know in our lives, you can't impose trust. Trust is earned, trust is built. And governments by nature, I don't know about states in the Caribbean, but certainly across Africa, we suffer from, bloated bureaucracy, which operates like molasses. Of course, there's that hydra of corruption and overall lack of capacity. And then we've tried going in the direction of using or leveraging the private sector in terms of the private sector driving the process. And again, we found the hard way that it's difficult for competitors to collaborate. And quite frankly, when in terms of where you invest your money, internet exchange points actually are not, most are not profitable at all. In fact, most organizations that support internet exchange points, if there are businesses, it's in order to facilitate other aspects of their business. So it's definitely not profitable in the short run. And so, after going, through the desert and wandering like Moses, we've realized that the community, multi-stakeholder, organic growth, which requires, as they would say, a few good people with passion, with some level of transparency, a vision, and basically selflessness to basically take this forward. So we have our Nigerian Internet Exchange Point, which consists of about 6 other sub-points, but I'll get into that. So that's our primary vehicle. So in terms of when we look at how this thing works, at least in our context, where we've tried to locate some of these exchanges has related to the number of ISPs, the volumes of traffic, issues such as availability of connectivity, particularly fiber, and where we are now leaning to the model very much of co-locating with data centers, but those data centers we have to make sure that they are carrier neutral. We actually have one instance where a data center is owned by an ISP, but they spun it off as an independent business and thereby qualifies, as carrier neutral. We've also found that if you have too many IXPs, you introduce another level of inefficiency. So each region, each country, each situation has to find its optimum balance. And I know this doesn't happen in the Caribbean, but we've had to place one exchange point in each geopolitical zone. I know the Caribbean doesn't have political issues. You're all having fun in the sun. But the truth is that politics is a factor, and you have to understand it. So when we look at some of the challenges that ISPs have faced, distributed denial of service, certainly. And, the typical traditional blackholing has not worked very well. So there are now advanced blackholing techniques, which seem to, at least for now, help. Sometimes IXPs are located in our case, we used to have a government telecoms company, which has now gone defunct, bankrupt, doesn't work anymore, but the facilities are there. But because they're rather aged, you place them in the same facility with the old telex machines. But the point is that sometimes the security, the physical security in this case, is not really as up to date as it should be. Even when you co-locate in highly secure modern data centers, belonging to those kind of providers, you have to make sure that access to the IXP systems, equipment is highly restricted and monitored, so only designated people. We've also found, obviously, that interlinked IXPs need to have some similarities in terms of basic technology and capacity in order to provide redundancy for each other. Some of you, I'm sure, are aware that we have organizations like Boko Haram and ISWAP. These are terrorist organizations, and they perceive the internet from 3 perspectives. One, as a tool to generate, their propaganda, but as a medium to propagate propaganda, but also a target. So that, they bomb base stations, they try to bomb exchange points, and those kind of identified points of failure. Also, of course, IXPs can act as inadvertently as conduits for some of these bad actors who are going, somewhere beyond to cause mayhem and havoc. And so there has been a call, and we're working on trying to liaise with local SOCs, especially the government, the National Cybersecurity Center, so that they can actually help us in terms of monitoring our logs and looking at what's happening. But also, as I mentioned earlier on, IXPs present themselves as an ideal opportunity for the national security establishment to monitor. And so it's not always that you can stop them, because national security tends to have a higher political value in the community. But the management and the community that control the IXPs really have to be quite firm that the rule of law must apply in the context, in our case and in the case of many of you, democratic norms and values, so that somebody who wants to monitor his, his daughter's boyfriend because he works in the national security establishment shouldn't be able to do so. At the end of the day, really, many of these things boil down to common sense and sound judgment. It is assumed that an IXP ought to have some kind of management board. It doesn't necessarily have to be a formal board, but certainly it has to be some kind of overall governance entity. And that's whom the IXP management needs to be able to report to. That governance board needs to be representative of the stakeholders, including civil society, including the ISPs, the mobile network operators and all the others. At the end of the day, I think it's important for all of us to look through the lens of an IXP being an existential challenge if it goes down. It doesn't mean that the economy will immediately tank, but it does mean that points will be knocked off your gross domestic product, your economy, if your connectivity is either not trusted or is inefficient. In Nigeria, and again, I don't know how many other nations across the Caribbean have this, but we have a 2015 Cybercrime Act. And within that act, there are actually legal obligations, fiduciary responsibilities, and indeed, in some instances, personal liability for people who are directors or managers or even senior staff of not just ISPs, but inclusive of IXPs. So this is something that, again, maybe you'd want to think about. At the end of the day, when we look at issues relating to the top level security management, especially from the board, the strategic level, of course, they have to have some kind of visibility in terms of what management is doing to identify some of the challenges. Are risk assessments being conducted? Are they being conducted properly? Not necessarily, getting into the technical nitty-gritty. What's being done to protect, are appropriate safeguards being put in place to ensure, uninterrupted delivery of services? Are we able to identify the occurrence of cybersecurity events? Unfortunately, as we've seen with some of the, even in ISPs, but end users, sometimes the bad actors can be in your system for months and years. And in fact, there was a case somewhere in Africa with one of our continental organizations where the telemetry from the cameras, the security cameras, and some of the cameras that were in sensitive locations within that organization basically was being funneled out of Africa. And in fact, it was one of the countries in, I think it was Southeast Asia, that noticed, this data being exfiltrated. And also another incident we had where the data was going at funny times in the evening. And of course, these are things that have to be looked at, and at least some kind of red flag needs to come up, or early warning system. So there are issues relating to response planning, your communications and analysis, and there's always room for improvement. We need to be able to restore capabilities when they go down. I don't want to say if they go down. And so just for emphasis, again, the board, they may be unpaid, they may be volunteers, but they do need to represent the stakeholder group, and they do have responsibilities. And depending on the specific legislations in your country, they will have criminal, certainly civil liability. So some of the things you need to think about from a board perspective, from the strategic perspective, the buck does stop with the board. We need to be very proactive. You do need to have a plan, but please, we must appreciate that in any war, the first casualty of war is the plan. Immediately you must rule. You cannot be unduly and overly bureaucratic, even though you do need some level of bureaucracy to keep things steady. And one of the things I think is that whenever there is an incident, whether it's a near miss, it's a learning opportunity. And so I would encourage every one of you to ask 3 questions. One is, what did we do right during this situation? Even if you lost the farm, maybe you got there on time, maybe you noticed something, but it can't be 100% all bad. There must be some nuggets of value that you can take away. But the big question is, what could be done better in any given situation? And I would strongly urge you not to get into what went wrong. That gets into blaming. It's not very constructive, and certainly it doesn't provide a learning experience. And also you need to be able to think in terms of, so what next? We've had situations where organizations had ransomware attacks, for example. They paid off the ransom, their systems were restored, and within 2 weeks, the same gang using the same techniques caused the same the same damage. So which means that there was no corrective, the doors were not locked, and clearly the lesson either wasn't learned or not applied quickly enough. Another very important area from a cybersecurity perspective is that management, but particularly the board, needs to be able to create safe spaces for reporting. Now, one of the challenges you have with regulators is that regulators often want to quickly impose fines, quickly impose sanction. And so when you have that kind of atmosphere, people don't want to report. So you have to be able to create these, safe areas for people to interact, to speak. From the Chief Information Security Officer perspective, they need to be able to have access to the board, but they need to keep that access very tight and efficient. Briefings need to be short, simple, direct, and they need to provide realistic options, not simply just say, well, you have ABC, but clearly A and B are not realistic, only C is. You can't give a board that, you have to give them 1 or 2 realistic options. But of course, then you have your recommendations and you move forward. There are other kinds of issues in terms of the supply chain, in terms of budget, in terms of leadership. In the Nigerian context, cyber liability insurance is nascent. It's just taking off. I'd be very curious and interested in hearing the situation of cyber insurance, if any, in the Caribbean. One of the questions that came up a little earlier was the issue of some IXPs not permitting or not wanting non-ISPs to interconnect. And I give the example of Nigeria, where what we find happening is that we have the National Research Education Network. And basically that consists, well, it's not all connected, but you have 174 universities. You have probably 400 research institutes. And so they are in their own network. And this is not something, the IXP should prevent from connecting. Not only because they are a major block in of themselves, but as an IXP, you need to be able to build relationships with academia. Because at the end of the day, as many speakers have said, it's about people. But people need capacity building. You need to build the pipelines of those people who have the consciousness, especially the security consciousness, to be able to operate the IXPs. So some direct takeaways from the Nigerian situation. At the end of the day, really, what you find is that we need to be able to enhance collaboration. You need to be able to convince stakeholders, raising their awareness. There are many stakeholders who either don't know the IXP exists or just simply don't understand it can save money. It has efficiency and other value adds. Again, in our Moses taking the Israelite journey that we took, we at the end of the day, we just went back to basics. We began very, very small. We focused on exchange traffic. We focused on the peering issues. Not that agreements and contracts and politics are not important, but your energy really needs to go into, the exchange of traffic, because that's your raison d'etre. It's very crucial to have these strategic alliances. You need to build them with the regulator, with your top level domain, with the ISPs, and yes, with, for example, the NREN, the research network, but also the government data centers. There are a few other challenges, but really, your core team at the IXP level needs to have a lot of patience, as they say, the patience of Job, because of the long gestation period. The lack of capacity and capability, especially the human resource part, is something that brings tears to our eye. And I think one of the other speakers talked about the issues around the ASNs. There are institutions in Nigeria that have acquired an ASN, but they're not connected to the IXP. So those are and there's a reason for it. The reason is that they actually don't have the institutional capacity to be able to, first of all, apply the ASN to their own internal network and then link that network subsequently into the IXP. So this is where the IXP needs to be able to go out of the way, even if it's free trading provided. Yes, we have grown the local market. Again, it's through forums, workshops, trainings, events like this. But at the end of the day, part of our thinking has been we need to focus on some of these specialized trainings on the educational institutions, because that's where the pipelines, the human resource pipelines are. And frankly, yes, a university with 20, 30,000 students is, and most of our students these days have some kind of device within the context of the university or other higher education institution. And so they are a significant focused community that actually, provide a lot of a bang for the buck, if I may say, or for the time and effort investment. So in concluding, really, for me, keeping these things secure boils down to building trust. Building these IXPs is more about passion, not profit. If you're in it for the money, I think you should go somewhere else. It's also about persuasion, not imposition. And this is where this multi-stakeholder community, I think, comes into the fore. And I'd just like to build on something. I think it was Bevel said, in the opening ceremony. Building trust and addressing cyber malfeasance requires global multi-stakeholder collaboration, as one weak link potentially undermines, the global value chains. And so I think it's imperative, I believe it's imperative that the Caribbean nations, for example, the Caribbean organizations, the people of the Caribbean are not the weak link. And I think this is where the strength of CarPIF, especially its multifaceted linkages and scope of professional stakeholders, as we've seen today, really can optimally foster multi-stakeholder collaboration, trust, security, because of their expertise. And I think this needs to be done not just in the best interest of humanity, but in the best interest of the Caribbean. So at the end of the day, where you're going to locate it, if you can share with the data center, please make sure it's carrier neutral, because especially the private sector, sometimes it's dog eat dog. And so trust is a big issue. Certainly, I would recommend, the multi-stakeholder membership organization type of route for the governance structure of the IXP. And really, small networks can successfully address big problems, primarily through collaboration, but also by breaking problems into their component parts. So on that note, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. I'm honored that you have given me the time to interact with you. And thank you.
Thank you very much, Abdul. We've actually used up the every last second of the time slot allotted, but there is one question in the Q&A pod, which I think Bevel will forgive me for taking a minute or two to exchange with you. But before we do that, I really wanted to thank you on re-emphasizing an important message that we have been putting out in the Caribbean, the importance of keeping local traffic local. And this is a message that Bevel and others have been trying to drum home to engineers in this region. And it was really good to hear the same message coming from one of our friends from outside of the region. And this emphasizes the importance of collaborating, even though, persons are thousands of miles away, because the issues are the same. So to read the question in the chat, first it's a comment. Excellent presentation, Abdul. Many of the points from the Nigerian African experience resonate powerfully with us in the Caribbean. There is a view that IXPs make it easier for external state actors to spy on Caribbean states. Do you have any thoughts on this? So I think I'll give you about 1 or 2 minutes to reply to that.
Okay. Unfortunately, the potential is there. And so the issue is not about the potential, it's about us not giving the opportunity. And so that's where these issues relating to governance, controls, monitoring come into play. And if I may use an example from social media, in our part of the world, people are very, there's a lot of angst against government efforts to control social media. But the challenge is that social media is controlled anyway. I mean, we can ask former President Trump about Twitter, but the issue is who controls it. And so coming back to the IXP example, states are going to try and take the mile if you give them the inch. What is important, in my opinion, both in the social media aspect and also in the IXP aspect, is that you have the rule of law within the context of a democratic society that many of our nations are trying to build. So it's important that even if the government does want some information from the IXP, there must be some kind of established protocols and procedures that the government has to adhere to, preferably that have been approved by your National Assembly or the like. Of course, not every nation is democratic, but for me, I think that's the context. So you can't eliminate it, but what you have to do is you have to have that vigilance to stop abuse. It's the abuse that's the problem.
Thank you very much for that response. I think we still have about 1 or 2 minutes left. You focused a lot about the issue of trust. And this is also an issue for us in the Caribbean. And I noticed that you sort of slid easily and related that to having a multi-stakeholder or organic model. How do you see the relationship and the mechanics of governments working together with the technical and security community in terms of reaching the objective of having this element of trust so that our IXPs can function as we expect them to?
Well, I think the single most important issue is actually language. Governments, business people, technical people, civil society simply do not speak the same language. I mean, we may all speak English or patois or whatever, but the truth of the matter is that our jargon is different. So I think one of the first things that community needs to do is create some kind of understood communication, language. And then I think also, like I said, transparency is extremely important. Predictability to some extent is extremely important. And this is where sometimes, things like drills, cyber drills come into place, so that if something does happen, what would you do? Again, this is just the analogy would be like your local fire drill or your local storm drill. If you know this is where you gather, this is where you do. So it kind of becomes a little more mechanical, but more importantly, it becomes predictable. It's when you have lack of communication, unpredictability, then you create the gaps for, remember, bad actors are not simply hackers in some basement. They may actually, excuse me, be government officials. We've seen abuse of power across the world. So it's not restricted to any country, region, or even group of people. So, if you can put language, predictability, transparency, I think then you at least take care of, I don't want to, okay, 90%, I mean, the bulk of the problem, the bulk of the challenge.
Thank you very much for that. Before we end the session, I'll just read this last comment in the Q&A from the president of the St. Lucia ICT Association, Jerry George. He says it becomes easier to effect spying without an IXP, as the traffic is already flowing outside of their jurisdiction. As such, there is no ability to prevent or detect any spying which may occur. The IXP is local. There is some ability to provide local oversight to ensure that such activities do not happen. If it is spying by the government that is of concern, then they can effect such via the ISPs anyway. So the threat is no greater than having the IXP. So I think with that, I see you nodding your head. Abdul.
I would say thank you, George.
There you go. So with that, we are very happy to have had your presentation. I think there's a lot of food for thought there in what you presented to us that Caribbean engineers can use as a seed to discussions of how we can move forward and help improve our networks. So with 1 minute in hand, I am happy to hand over to Stephen, who I see is smiling to have been getting a lead. Usually we are behind time. So thank you, Abdul, and over to you, Stephen.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.